Hey guys, we are back updating the power rankings for Hell's Kitchen Head Chefs Only following episode 6, which was a fine episode, all things considered, and there were definitely some interesting things to get into with certain people, but we'll get to that soon enough. But we have 13 people to talk about, and as always, some more time. Let's get right into the video. So starting off at number 13, we have the latest boot from the season, and here we have Magali. And Magali is an interesting case here, as she was towards the bottom half of my power ranking for a lot of the season, but she was above certain other people because she had more personal content, and I felt like there was a sliver of a chance that she could have done well and potentially emerged from the cracks. But the point that she had another pretty bad episode service-wise, with her having a pretty bad service on the fish station, her making tons of mistakes to the point that her team gets kicked out of the service, I felt like she was probably going home here. And while a lot of the focus was about the likes of Brittany and Megan going up, and with it being so obvious that Magali was the main reason her team sucked at the service, I felt like it was pretty clear that Ramsey was going to eliminate her without a nomination. So again, not too surprising result here. And again, Magali was kind of there in the season. It was definitely interesting getting to talk to her on the recap stream, which was pretty fun there, but I never really saw her as having much of a chance on the season considering the edits that she was getting, not to mention that her performance across the actual services was not as strong compared to the other players, and it was just a matter of time before she eventually got cut. So again, there's that, but she's now out of the game, which is why she's here at number 13. And with that, we have 12 people left in the game to talk about, and as usual, I'll be ranking them based on how likely I think they are to win the game based on their edit and current game position. By number 12, the person I believe is the least likely to win from this point on is another switch from last week. I did put this person back at the bottom. By number 12, we do have Amanda, and I feel like Amanda is probably the least edited player on the season at this point. I feel like she doesn't really have much depth to her edit. I feel like we don't really know much about her, and I feel like she hasn't really been focused on much. And on top of that, she hasn't really been that impressive of a performer, where while she did fine the challenge getting a point against Lulu, I feel like beyond that, a lot of her content is very surface level, and I feel like we aren't really getting much from her. And I feel like at this point, she's probably not winning the season. I don't really feel that great about her, which is why she's here at number 12. Now moving on to number 11, and we have the person who was at the bottom of last week's ranking, but we do have Anne-Marie. And I was wrong about Anne-Marie being the next boot here, where I said last week that she was probably the next to go from the red team, only for her to not be, so at least there's that. And admittedly, her performance in this episode isn't that bad, where again, she does fine the challenge, getting a point there. She also has a fine enough service, not really making any mistakes there, but beyond that, I feel like this episode didn't really move the needle for me. I still feel largely the same about Anne-Marie, which wasn't very high to begin with. And I feel like with there being so many people that I just have a higher view on, either from an edit perspective or from a performance perspective, I did have to leave Anne-Marie behind here at number 11. Now moving on to number 10, and this person has gone down compared to last week. By number 10, we do have Brittany. And Brittany's someone who I've kind of wavered on a bit during the season, where I feel like there are moments where she gets decent enough personal content, and she does seem to be like a fun enough character there. But I feel like this episode was pretty bad for her performance-wise, where she did pretty poorly in the challenge, losing a point there, and then making some mistakes on the actual service that resulted in her being put up. And while I didn't think she was going home in this episode, I don't think this is a great look for Brittany at the end of the day. And while you can argue that there's a debate for her having this underdog story with her being underestimated, and with people like Whit like talking about how like she sucks and that Whit's dish should have been chosen for the challenge over Brittany's, at the end of the day, I feel like Brittany's still someone who I'm kind of on the fence on, someone who I just don't feel the greatest about, and I feel like with my opinion wavering so much, I do have to leave her behind at number 10. Now moving on to number 9, and we have another person who has gone down compared to last week, but we do have Brandon, and this was another shaky episode for him performance-wise, where he does pretty mediocrely in the challenge, but still gets a point because he was up against Brittany, which caused a tie, and then during the service, he ends up making a mistake during the actual service. And while I can debate Brandon being higher due to him not being the worst performer in the world, and despite him having a somewhat consistent presence on the season, I feel like he's not someone we're supposed to be rooting for. I feel like he's someone who is kind of letting other people down. I feel like he's someone who is just kind of getting content here and there, like not really having much of a future storyline. And I feel like he's someone who I'm not the highest on at this point, which is why he is here at number 9. Now moving on to number 8, and we have someone who has gone up compared to last week, and that is Egypt. And this was definitely an interesting ride here for Egypt, where last week he ended up having this pretty massive performance, like having a pretty big episode here with him almost wanting to quit, but then turning it around and having a decent service. And then this episode, he has a cooldown episode, not really getting too much focus there, while still having a decent service with him being shown like kind of finding his footing in the kitchen. And it does seem like he is starting to improve, like actually starting to build better relationships with the rest of his team, to where it does seem like he is becoming a slightly more effective leader there. And I feel like with him like not really being overexposed in this episode, considering how massive of an edit he got in the last episode, I do feel like this is probably a positive for Egypt here. And obviously we'll have to see where things go in the future, but I am starting to climb my way back up on my view of Egypt, which is all pretty good. But I still feel like I feel better about other people, which is why he is here at number 8. Now moving on to number 7, and this person has actually gone down compared to last week, not so much because of anything particularly bad with their episode, but due to one person going up and also due to the next time on, but we do have Hannah. And again, this was kind of a fine episode for Hannah here where, yeah, she does lose a point in the challenge, but she was up against Joe, who was being propped up as this pretty big threat, so I don't really give too much credence for that. Though beyond that, she does also make a mistake on the meat station where she ends up making too much food there along with Brittany, which is obviously not a great look here. So again, it was kind of a whatever episode for Hannah if you ask me, but I think something to take into account is the next time on, where it does suggest that Hannah is open to quitting the game. Like, that was a big selling point there. Now, do I actually think she's going to quit the game? I don't think so. I think this is just something that she considers for a moment or entertains, but quickly drops it thereafter. So again, I'm not saying she's actually going to quit the game here, but I feel like considering that this wasn't the best episode for her to begin with, and also one person going up, I did decide to leave her behind here at number 7. Now moving on to number 6, and this person has gone up compared to last week, but number 6 we do have Joe. And again, there's a debate for Joe, like, and whether he should truly move up or not, as admittedly, a lot of his content here feels circumstantial, where he is getting a lot of content during the challenge with him being propped up as this big threat because he's Italian, I guess, and I guess he's really good at making pasta, and sure enough, he does end up winning the challenge on the tiebreaker there, so I guess it's warranted. And then beyond that, he does get some decent narrational content during the service, talking about how, like, he felt like tonight was going to be chaos, but then when the blue team ends up doing well in the service, he gets to talk again about how he was glad to finish service and that he didn't think the competition would be this hard. So again, you can definitely debate over how circumstantial a lot of Joe's content here was, but he also has been getting some personal content earlier on this season, so I don't think Joe's necessarily dead per se. I feel like there is more legs for Joe to stand on edit-wise compared to other people. And I feel like with Hannah's episode being kind of whatever, it was enough to slide Joe up one spot to number 6. Now moving on to number 5, and we actually have another person who has moved down compared to last week, but number 5 we do have Lulu. And again, this was a pretty mediocre episode for Lulu here, where she ended up doing pretty bad at the actual challenge, which is not great. And then during the service, you have her running the fish station by herself and saying how this is Gordon Ramsay testing her, only for her to make a mistake, which is obviously not the greatest look in the world there. So admittedly, it was a bad episode for Lulu performance-wise, and there's definitely a debate for her being below Joe, but I feel like with Joe kind of being up and down in his own edit, and with the debate for Joe's content being mostly circumstantial, I did decide to give Lulu the benefit of the doubt for this week at least, though if she ends up having another bad episode, then I'll probably move down Lulu at that point, but I feel like for now it wasn't enough to have her here at number 5. Now moving on to number 4, and it's kind of funny that this person has moved up considering that this person was actually on the block this week. But at number 4 we do have Megan, and admittedly I've been a bit of a Megan defender. I feel like her performance has actually been pretty consistent for a lot of the season, and I don't think her edit's been that bad either, where, yeah, well, she hasn't gotten the most content in the world. I feel like the content she has gotten has been mostly solid, and I feel like now seeing it play out in this episode, I think there's definitely a strong argument that this could be this turning point for Megan, where apparently the issue for Megan this episode was that she was too quiet in the fish station. She didn't really kick Magali off after Magali kept screwing up, and while that didn't seem to be the reality based on what we heard from the recap stream, the show's presenting that as if that's what happened, and we see Megan like kind of struggling to see her voice there, and it got to the point where Whit was trying to target her, and sure enough, Megan was put up. And again, while I didn't think she was going home here, I do think that her being put up in the spot to where she was too quiet, in a spot to where her edit had her being relatively quiet, could point to this turning point for her, where I feel like unlike other people who have gotten like these smaller edits, I feel like Megan's has been a bit more intentional, and I feel like there's now the storyline for Megan to raise her voice more and to become a bigger force on the actual show. And again, we'll have to see if it actually pans out, but I still actually feel pretty solid about Megan after this episode, where I feel like she is like one of the more competent chefs on the board, and I feel like she's someone who definitely has the storyline there to become this more vocal leader, to prove everyone wrong. So at the end of the day, I feel like this was still a pretty solid episode for Megan, and we'll have to see whether the storyline gets followed up upon. I did decide to leave her here at number 4. Now moving on to number 3, and this person was definitely difficult to assess here. This person had a pretty big episode, However, I'm not entirely sure if it's meant to be positive or not, but number 3, we do have Whit. And obviously, Whit was someone I was pretty high on for a lot of the season. She seemed to be one of the bigger characters on the season, one of the more competent chefs on the board. And we definitely see that play on this episode, where she was shown making the better dish during the challenge, only for it to not be selected here. She seems to be one of the more serious chefs in terms of cutting the weak links, and obviously she does pretty well during the actual service there. So again, I think there's definitely more of that in this episode. But I think what makes things a bit more difficult for Whit here is that a lot of it seemed to be kind of mean-spirited and sort of her being this villain, where she talks at the beginning of the episode about cutting the weak links immediately after they had this good service and after they had this non-elimination round. We have her getting really indignant about the whole challenge situation and her having multiple confessionals about, oh, we would have won the challenge if they went with my dish over Brittany's. And I felt like the show was really hammering that in. And then during the actual service, we have her focusing way more on Megan's leadership than the fact that Magali was making all these mistakes. And I'm not really sure what to make of that at the end of the day. Now, I did think in the moment that it was mostly good, as the show wasn't really showing Whit being in the wrong here, considering that they did show the judge saying that her dish was in fact better than Brittany's. Not to mention that her actual performance during the service was itself pretty good, with her having pretty good leadership and not really making any mistakes there. So I did think in the moment that Whit was being shown in the right here, considering that she was genuinely one of the stronger chefs here and that she is one of the more serious people here. But I think now, looking back in hindsight, I do think that it could just be setting up Whit to be this villain, considering that her idea of taking on the weak links was targeting Megan, someone who was clearly not the weak link on the red team versus Magali. And I could see this world where now we had this rivalry between Whit and Megan, where over time Megan ends up overtaking Whit and being like the better leader and someone who is clearly like the better fit to win the season compared to Whit. So I do think that this could be like this turning point in Whit's edit, where she could become this massive villain in the future as Megan starts to shoot up. So who knows where it's really going, but I feel like for now, considering all these factors, considering that it's still up in the air over whether Whit will actually win the season by the end, I did decide to leave her here on number 3. Now moving on to number 2, and this person has gone up solely because Whit has moved down due to my question marks about them. But number 2, we do have Kyle. And again, sort of similar to Egypt, this was a cooldown episode for Kyle, considering that he had a pretty massive episode last week. So for him to get a cooldown episode here is pretty good. Not to mention that his actual service was pretty decent, with him doing well in the challenge, not making any mistakes during the actual service. So again, I feel like this episode was what Kyle needed after last week. And I feel pretty good about Kyle at this point. And with me having less question marks about Kyle's edit compared to Whit's, I did decide it was enough to slide him up to number 2. And now, at number 1, the person I believe is the most likely to win Hell's Kitchen Head Chefs Only at this point is still Anthony. And it seems like more people are catching on to Anthony at this point, considering this was a massive breakout episode for him, with him getting tons of personal content at the beginning, talking about his grandma and how he's not there for her funeral, and that he got the call to be on the show the same day that his grandma died, which is then followed up by a very strong performance where he does pretty well in the challenge, and then does very well in the actual service, where he talks about how the meat station is a monster and that he needs to be on top of it. And sure enough, he does so, where he ends up being a very strong leader during the actual service, doesn't make any mistakes. We have Ramsey really complimenting him. And again, it was a very strong breakout episode for him. And I feel like this just really confirmed to me what I said earlier about Anthony, where while he hasn't gotten the most content in the world during these early episodes, I feel like his edit was still very strong beforehand, where he had a very solid premiere, getting a very solid introduction there, and then still like getting like check-ins during the other episodes where his team wasn't doing so well. And I feel like a lot of it was just setting up for Anthony to be the solid contender. So I feel like at the end of the day, I feel like this episode simply confirmed to me that Anthony is the front runner, where I've had him at number 1 for pretty much the entire season up to this point. And it seems like now more people are catching on to his edit. So I feel like for those reasons, I still have Anthony here at number 1. And there we go. That'll do it for this week's video. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps with the channel. Now I'll be back again next week to update the power rankings again, so you can look forward to that. I'm still covering Survivor 47 and doing weekly power rankings of that show, so you can expect that as well. I'm on Patreon and have YouTube membership, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description. And you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is a video. See ya.